All right, so we're going to talk a little bit today about culture and education. And I want to begin with a guy named Lev Vygotsky. I think you all know who he is. He was the guy who told us that the most efficient education takes into account the brain, and told us that there is a zone of proximal development, or ZPD, defined by the individual brain of the learner, such that if we teach below that zone of proximal development, it results in tedium for the student. And if we teach above it, beyond their reach, it results in frustration. The most important thing for us today is to recognize that education is an interaction with the personal identity. There's a metaphor to be drawn between Vygotsky's emphasis on cognitive capacity and cultural identity. Education is an inherently cultural enterprise, so it's both a preserver and a challenger of cultural values. And when you bring that to a student, we have to take into account that student's culture. So we're going to talk a little bit about student identity and the things that make identity, or the value set that defines who you are. James Banks suggests that identity could be a combination of any of 6 factors. He includes race, religion, class, gender, and what he calls exceptionality. This could be anything from an IEP or diagnosis to identification as gifted. Importantly, these factors don't play independent parts in how you approach education. Instead, they are brought into you as a recipe that combines, such that a lesbian who is of Catholic faith tradition may be experiencing this thing differently from, say, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant man in a Southwest Missouri environment. So we have this nucleus of culture and cultural values and expectations, which is the result of this recipe. And one might imagine that Vygotsky would say the same for your culture that he said for your cognitive capacity, that there is a limit to the amount of stretch we can ask from a given learner culturally when we bring content to them. All of this surrounding this idea that education is a personal enterprise. It's a relationship between content and learner. So, with this framework in mind, there's one more critical element for us to consider, and that is this. You, as the instructor, have your own profile. You have your own gender. You have your own race, class, exceptionality, and religion. And you bring this to the classroom. So now we're not just talking about bringing the content in a meaningful way to the student. We're talking about your capacity and your negotiation with that content. We'll talk about identifying these things about ourselves and how we deal with them on an instructional basis in our next lecture.